Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. How's everyone doing? Doing good? Okay, well, welcome to the official kickoff of the National World War II Museum's 17th International Conference on World War II. For those of you that I haven't met yet, I'm Stephen Watson, and I have the privilege of being the president and CEO here at the museum. All right. Thank you, Bob Hayes. I appreciate that. It is great to see everybody here in the Madeleine and Paul Hilliard Conference Center. And I know many of you were here earlier today for our pre-conference symposium, The Battle of the Bulge Revisited, 80 Years On. It was a really great start to what I know is going to be another wonderful couple of days. That was also the latest in a series of programs commemorating the 80th anniversary events of World War II, and that will, of course, continue through next September. And this will include a special end-of-war symposium right here in this ballroom in August. So please make sure to mark your calendars. I'm sure we have information about that you can get from our folks outside. So once again, this year we have a sold-out conference. And I want to thank each and every one of you for making that possible. Welcome to those of you that are here for the first time. And thank you to those who have perfect attendance over the last almost 20 years. I know we have a few of you here, but this is one of the wonderful things about these few days, is getting to meet great new friends of the museum, visit with folks that we've gotten to become close to over the last 20 years. And I know for many of you, that's one of the highlights of being here this weekend as well. And also, I'd like to thank the thousands who have registered and are watching online. Every year, our online audiences grow. I think the first year we did this, it was Jeremy and I that watched it online from our desks, and we kept reloading it to try and pump up the numbers a little bit, but this year, it will literally be in the hundreds of thousands, which is just remarkable. So now I have a few important things to do, and the first one is one of our favorite traditions here at the museum, and I want to just take a moment to recognize a few special folks that are in the audience. And tonight, we're very fortunate to be joined by a person that many of you here know. That is World War II veteran Paul Hilliard and his wife Madeline. Paul is the only World War II veteran on the Board of Trustees here at the museum. He has attended every single one of the 17 international World War II conferences. I would also note he was the first one here this morning in this room. And I think you knew Paul flew 45 missions as a radio man and a gunner and an SBD Dauntless dive bomber in the Pacific Theater. And Paul, we thank you again for your service. It's usually right about now that he tells me to wrap it up and get off the stage. You know that's true. But thank you, Paul. Thank you, Madeline, for this beautiful conference center that we have that makes programs like this possible, and for all that you've done to support our mission. I'd also invite any veterans or active duty members of our armed forces from any era, please stand or wave to be recognized for your service to our country. My thanks to all of you and to all the family members of veterans and active duty members who take care of those who take care of us. I'm also delighted to say we have several past and present members of the museum's Board of Trustees with us this evening. I'm going to mention them. Mike Byland, also a 17-time conference attendee. Mike, thank you, sir. Bob Hayes, thank you. It's great to see you, sir. Paul Hilliard, as I mentioned. Greg Kowalski, I think you're here somewhere, sir. There you are, Greg. Great to see you. Deborah Lindsay, I saw Deborah from a distance earlier today. Deborah, it's wonderful that you're back here again. Nick Mueller, and I'll have a few more words to say about Nick in a second. And Will Osborne, and last but not least, Governor Pete Wilson. It's wonderful that you are here, sir. And when I come to these events, many of you come up and are just amazed at all that this museum is, the campus, the breadth of these programs, the travel programs, all the great work that we do. And it's a testament to the courage, the leadership, and the spirit of the Board of Trustees who have led the way over these last 20-plus years to create this wonderful institution. And it's amazing that you all are here for such a special weekend as well. So thank you again. So as I mentioned, this is our 17th International Conference, and for 14 of those years, we've had the support of an important partner, our presenting sponsor, the Pritzker Military Foundation and the Pritzker Military Museum and Library. They are quite busy right now. Some of you may know this, having just moved from their Chicago headquarters to a new and impressive facility in Kenosha, Wisconsin. So they couldn't be here. They're unpacking boxes, I'm sure, right now as we speak. But I wanted to thank the team at the Pritzker, Roberto Bravo, Karima Cruz, Susan Rifkin, and of course, Colonel Jennifer Pritzker, sending you our deepest gratitude and appreciation for all that you've done to help make this event the great event that it is. So please give them a round of applause. And a few other individuals that have helped make this possible, working diligently behind the scenes. And I referenced them a moment ago. I mention this every year because it needs to be mentioned, and that is Nick Mueller, my predecessor, our founding president and CEO, now president and CEO emeritus. This was Nick's idea, and I think one of the great parts of our rebirth coming out of Hurricane Katrina, which will be 20 years ago next year, was this magnificent international conference that happened on this campus in 2006. And that was Nick's vision with a small group of trusted advisors. So thank you, Nick, for getting this started. And as you will see, continues to be a really important part of the work that we do today. And I also want to acknowledge and thank our conference planning committee who work alongside Dr. Bell, Jeremy, and our staff to put this program together. We have many of them here with us this weekend. Alex Ritchie, Gunter Bischoff, Con Crane, Rich Frank. It was wonderful to visit with you a few minutes ago. Don Miller, John Morrow, and the chair of that committee that you'll hear from in a few seconds, Alan Mallette. So please give them a round of applause also. And last but not least, to the 26 speakers who are sharing their time and their expertise with us this weekend, please stand and be recognized. This is what makes this conference so wonderful. Thank you. So, in closing here, I want to do an introduction for Alan. So, in addition to serving as the chair of the Conference Planning Committee, Alan Mallette is the convener of the Presidential Counselors Advisory Group here at the museum, and also a senior military advisor of the museum. He is a very important part in keeping our connection to the University of New Orleans, where the idea for the National D-Day Museum began 30-plus years ago. And I think it's safe to say that few have had the impact on the field of military history that Alan Mallette has had. 70 PhDs, some of you probably in this room. I think the impact that he has had over the last 50 years on the field and the study of military history is remarkable, and we are honored to have him engaged and involved with our museum in such an important way. So with that, it's my pleasure to welcome to the stage Dr. Alan Mallette. Thank you.
In the forgettable words of Secretary of State Alexander Haig, I'm in charge here. No, not really. Speaking for the presidential counselors, I want to thank all of them and all the other experts on Second World War who've contributed so much to the museum's development in the last 30 years. I became involved through my friendship with Steve Ambrose, who was kind enough to read the second version of For the Common Defense, a book that one of my students had written. And I found the other excuses to come to New Orleans and became involved in a critique of what became the Pacific War Wing of the museum, which was financed by a local Marine veteran named Jimmy Stone, and which had been looked at by Jim Livingston and John Ripley, very esteemed Marine officers, as being somewhat inadequate. The museum had not recognized that 6 Marine divisions had won the war against Japan by itself, and that Senator Stevens from Alaska had inserted the impression that the war for the Aleutians was more important than the liberation of the Marianas or the liberation of the Philippines. During those years, I was delighted to participate in the development of the museum, and I would certainly count myself as what in the Navy they call a plank holder, but a very small plank, to be sure. During those years, Nick Mueller, then in process of becoming president of the museum, asked me if I would retire from Ohio State. My football seats were getting worse all the time, and come to be a professor at UNO to replace Doug Brinkley, whom I found was roundly despised by everybody out at UNO. And with that background, I found a great welcome. In the meantime, I'd become involved with the Pritzker Military Museum and Library, which had established an award for people for lifetime achievement in military history, and I was fortunate to receive the second such award, which gave me some influence, I think, and access to work at Pritzker. And I must say, having watched its development, I'm delighted that we're still collaborators and working now with them in their new expanded Center for the Study of the Citizen Soldier in War and Peace seems to be a natural collaboration, and I think we'll be the stronger for it because I think that's how things work. What they're going to do at Kenosha is have a center which will memorialize the service of wartime volunteers and draftees, members of the militia, of the National Guard, both Army and Air Force, and the Federal Reserve Forces for all the services. And it will deal with warfare and deployments from Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as those in the past, as well as disaster duty throughout the United States, most recently in Florida and North Carolina. Now, to be honest with you, I don't know much about Kenosha. I used to pass through Wisconsin on my way to canoeing trips in Minnesota, and all I can remember is some place called the Dells, and people fished for muskie and ate a lot of cheese and ice cream. And that Madison was a hippie empire, and you didn't want to hang around there too long, and you'd pick up bad habits. But we'll give Wisconsin the benefit of the doubt. And I've learned since that actually the area around Kenosha is quite a nice holiday recreation area. One thing I don't think they'll be able to do is to move the statue of John A. Logan from Michigan Avenue up to Kenosha. But certainly the spirit of the citizen soldier will certainly flourish there. And I think that we will continue to be a part of that. And it's not an accident that not only did I receive a Pritzker Prize, that many other members of the presidential counselors, including people who are here tonight, like John Morrow. It includes Carlo Desta, Rick Atkinson, Craig Simons, Gerhard Weinberg. So there's been a symbiotic relationship which I think has profited both institutions, and we certainly hope in the future that our relations with the Pritzker Military Museum and Library will continue. Thank you very much.
Good evening. My task is to introduce our speaker for tonight, and it's Dr. Rob Citino. Certainly no stranger to the museum, to this audience, and to those watching online. You know, after speaking at conferences and leading tours across Europe with our educational travel programs, Rob actually joined the museum full-time as our Samuel Zemurray Stone Senior Historian in 2016, and then served as the executive director of the Institute for the Study of War and Democracy in 2018 to 2021. Of course, I came here in 2021, and Rob got to revert back to just being the historian again. Now, he came to the museum with an incredible list of publications. That's now grown to 11, which is pretty amazing. It includes Blitzkrieg to Desert Storm and the Wehrmacht Retreats, Fighting a Losing War in 1943, both of which went on to win the Society of Military History's Distinguished Book Award, making him one of the very select few that have ever won that award, let alone won it twice. And so, now, as many of you know, as one of the world's foremost leading experts on the military history of World War II, Rob has really honed his insights, but also shared his insights, teaching military history in a wide variety of institutions, including the United States Military Academy, the Army War College, and the University of North Texas. He's also a giant in the field and has influenced generations of military historians for these efforts. And because of that, he was awarded the Samuel Eliot Morrison Prize from the Society of Military History for Lifetime Achievement. And well done, Rob. Now, many people always ask, hey, where's Rob? It's like a where's Waldo type thing. Where's Rob? And Rob is retired from his full-time position at the museum, but he still continues to contribute to shape many of our initiatives at the museum as a distinguished fellow with the Jenny Craig Institute. And his influence and insight have been invaluable. He built upon his experience creating the Arsenal of Democracy Gallery. He went on to serve as our lead content expert for the museum's most recent pavilion, the award-winning Liberation Pavilion. So hopefully you'll have a chance to see that. And this evening, we're glad to have Rob back here with us to deliver our opening address. Now, it's entitled The Agony of Victory, the Final Costly Year of World War II. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Rob Citino to the stage.
Thank you, Michael. Right now, there's thousands of irate Wisconsins who are turning off the feed. And I'm very conscious of that, so I'm kind of nervous. So good to be back. I did formally retire at the beginning of 2024, but it's so good to be back in the house that Nick built. Stephen said that this is Nick's idea. We should have a sign, everything at this campus that is Nick's idea. There'd be a lot of signs. There really would. Nick, it's great to be back with you. Everyone in the front row, I too get nervous when I see Paul wave that cane, so I'll know that it's time for me to wrap things up. I've been asked to speak on the war year of 1945 tonight to you, and to try to make some sense of what happened in that last partial year, and that's never been an easy thing to do. Strategically speaking, I think we can agree the war was over. The Axis armies had been smashed, and they were on the run everywhere. The contest, in other words, was no longer in doubt. And once the drama is gone, many people tend to stop paying attention. 1945, in a typical undergraduate class on World War II, you kind of run through the syllabus and you're running out of time, and you just kind of say, and then a lot of horrible things happened. The Allies were supreme on land, sea, and air. But here's the thing, that this brief war year of 1945, so 4 months in Europe, 6 months plus in Asia, was in many ways the bloodiest year of the horrible entire global war, at least in terms of military dead. We need to specify that. Now, this may seem surprising. Simple math tells us that casualties in a partial year should be lower than in other complete years. But in fact, some 2 million or so of the roughly 6 million German war dead died in 1945. About a third of the total German war dead in that 4-month period. Soviets, a little more difficult to get a handle on the precise statistics. But let's say roughly 20% of all Soviet military dead in the 4 months of 1945. In 1945, the Soviets in those 4 months took roughly 750,000 casualties per month. Now, that's a mind-boggling number. You can break it down in different ways. I always tried to do that for my students, give them a number and then give them another number, and on and on. That's 25,000 per day for 4 straight months, and adds up to roughly 3 million dead in that period. And again, well over the expected average is my point. Now, I've taught World War II for many, many years to undergraduates at some of America's finest institutions, Eastern Michigan University, University of North Texas. I always say I taught ordinary undergraduates. And I kind of got a sense of how they viewed not just World War II, but war in general. I think they tended to see wars as something that opened with a bang. I guess maybe that's the American view, Pearl Harbor, in other words. It didn't just it didn't sort of slide into war gradually. It kind of suddenly was on our doorstep. It opens with a bang. It reaches a kind of peak of violence before slowly ebbing. And then it finally stumbles to an end when one side has had it, when one side is exhausted. In other words, if you think about what I just said, war to many people is a kind of novel. First, we set the scene. Then we build the tension. It reaches a climax. And it finally relaxes into a kind of denouement. The first French words we all learn in school. Now, there's just one problem with this scheme, and you probably know what it is, a perceptive group like this. War is not a novel. It is, above all, an act of violence, a wave of destruction and killing, where we set aside every rule, every law, even every sacred commandment that we've been taught, and we willingly, even sometimes eagerly, kill one another. Now, I'm going to press this green button here, and it's going to turn on a slide from what I've been told. Very good. Thank you. The great Prussian philosopher of war, Karl von Clausewitz, noted all this 2 centuries ago, writing largely in the 1820s. He spent a lifetime fighting the Napoleonic Wars. And he noted that wars, and especially great wars, they operate on a kind of internal logic that we can sometimes only dimly penetrate. Great wars don't simply peter out, he wrote. They keep getting worse the longer they drag on. The violence keeps ratcheting up in a reciprocal process. You don't have to dig very deeply into current events if you read newspaper headlines of the last 2 days about the escalating violence of war, which kind of happens as a reciprocal process. You do it, and so I do it, but I do it more. And then you have to kind of top my level of violence. Until, Clausewitz said, it reaches unrestrained levels. By the end of a great war, both sides have taken off their gloves. They abandon all restraint. And they do things they couldn't have imagined when the fighting began, which I think is a pretty good description, not just of World War II in general, but of war year 1945. And there's Clausewitz, one of his, say Clausewitz defined war, he did it in a number of ways. But here's one of his classic definitions of war. War is not a bar brawl, and it's not it's not simply a piece of fiction. It can't be analyzed like it's a novel. It is an act of violence to compel our enemy to do our will. So, my point is that I don't think Clausewitz would have been at all shocked at how World War II ended. Not with a whimper, as T.S. Eliot would say, not even with a bang, but with a bloodbath for everyone involved. In fact, if he were still alive and with us, he'd probably say it was a textbook case of what he had been saying. Now, what I'd like to do tonight is to come up the years from Clausewitz and examine the specific causes, the recipe, in other words, for this bloodbath. What turned World War II into the bloodbath it became in 1945? We'll get away from Clausewitz. I think there's a drinking game you can play when I say Clausewitz, by the way. I think we're doing pretty well so far. Clausewitz said that wars don't change. They're all alike. War has a certain nature that is unchangeable. It's been that way from the beginning, will be that way forever. But along with the unchangeable nature of war is a character problem, that each war can be different than the one that preceded it in its character. Fundamentally the same, but different kinds of characteristics. For example, a war fought before gunpowder and then a war fought with tanks are obviously going to have different characteristics to them, even though they may share an underlying nature. I believe that World War II's bloodbath, the year 45, this horrible year, was a result of the wartime strategies pursued by both sides. Now, that's almost a truism. Your strategy should determine how you fight the war, and when two strategies interplay, collide on the battlefield, a lot of things can happen. A lot of things can go right, and a lot of things can go wrong. But I think what happened in 1945 is embedded in this issue of wartime strategy. Now, I don't have to tell this room the Allied wartime strategy. If I were to say the word unconditional, you will all respond? Surrender. Thank you. Let's try that again. Unconditional. Surrender. Thank you. The Allies pursued, yes, a strategy of unconditional surrender, first enunciated by FDR at a press conference at the end of the Casablanca Conference in January of 1943. And there's there we go, coming up. There's the Allied Brain Trust at the Casablanca Conference in 1943. There would be unconditional surrender. There would be no negotiations with Hitler. Instead, the total overthrow of the Axis regimes, and we might say regime change, to use the contemporary term, would be the order of the day. Here's what FDR told the reporters. We seek the elimination of German, Japanese, and Italian war power. That means the unconditional surrender of Germany, Italy, and Japan. That means a reasonable assurance of future world peace. It does not mean the destruction of the populations of Germany, Italy, and Japan, but it does mean the destruction of the philosophies in those countries, which are based on conquest and the subjugation of other people. So, what does that mean? No quarter from the Allies. Now, I think we can say that this policy was mainly FDR's baby. And indeed, after he had proclaimed it, Churchill claimed to have been surprised when FDR announced it at that press conference. Now, we today know, the state of our knowledge marches on always. We know that in fact, Churchill was not surprised. He knew exactly what FDR was going to say. Perhaps Winston was laying the groundwork to disavow the strategy if it went badly. Because we should note that unconditional surrender is not how 99% of the wars in human history have ended. Wars usually end in some kind of negotiated settlement, no matter how horrible they've been, no matter how bloody they've been or how many casualties they've generated. And, for the test case of that, just look at the previous World War. It ended far short of the unconditional surrender of Germany. It ended, of course, in a negotiated settlement. Now, the Germans weren't happy with what they got out of the negotiations. We could talk about that, but the war ended in a negotiated settlement and the Treaty of Versailles. This really means there's not going to be a treaty. It's going to be unconditional surrender. There'll be no treaty after that. The Axis will have to put themselves into the hands of the Allies and hope for the best. Now, on the other side of the hill, Hitler and his Nazi minions, never a moderate bunch to begin with, needless to say, greatly radicalized their own conduct of the war the longer it went on. German strategy for the war's endgame consisted of something called total war, totaler Krieg, proclaimed in a speech by propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels at the Berlin Sportpalast in February of 1943. A faithful month indeed for reasons we'll talk about. And there's Goebbels speaking to the Berlin Sportpalast and proclaiming total war. Oh, notice up top, totaler Krieg, kürzester Krieg. The total war will be the shortest war. The more totally we fight it, the faster we're going to win it, so he said. Goebbels speaking. Total war is the order of the day. The Fuhrer has commanded, and we will follow. He was interrupted then by 15 minutes of the crowd chanting, Fuhrer commands, we follow. In this hour of national reflection and contemplation, we believe firmly and unshakably in victory. We see it before us. We need only grasp it. Let the slogan be, now, people, folk, rise up and let the storm break loose. Und Sturm bricht los. The sort of slogan of the German endgame in the war. Good propaganda photo, and that's the end of Goebbels' speech up top. Nun Volk steht auf, und Sturm bricht los. People rise up and let the storm break loose. So, the Allies were offering no quarter, and the Germans were offering no surrender. Germany would fight to the end, refusing to negotiate, refusing to settle, making Allied victory as expensive as possible every minute of the day through the fanatical resistance of the German people. French Revolution-style levée en masse, a big call-up. Specifically, the plan was to call up last-ditch levies of troops like the Volksgrenadier divisions, made up of manpower combed out of rear areas, supply, administration troops, even what were called lightly wounded men taken from their hospital beds, not all of whom still possessed all their arms and legs. They would keep alive the flame of resistance. And when those reserves were exhausted, and that's roughly late 1944, perfectly because we're talking about 45, Germany turned to so-called Volkssturm battalions, comprised of old men and young boys. Literally, grandpas and grandsons in the same unit. Hans and Opa, I guess we could say, given a single-shot anti-tank weapon, the Panzerfaust, and sent out to do or die versus the invaders. And there's a pretty good stage propaganda photo of Volkssturm training. There's a German army officer who's training, what looks like my Uncle Tony, in how to fight how to employ an anti-tank weapon. Now, it's one shot. That blunt warhead at the end, it flies off the launcher and hopefully kills the tank, but there's not a second shot. We should say this, you have to get pretty darn close to the tank, too. I mean, using the Panzerfaust was as close as we got to a death sentence, particularly when it's employed by somebody who looks like he's probably past his prime soldiering years. I mean, young men and boys, if there's one trope, one sort of literary phrase of the German endgame in World War II, you hear old men and boys all the time. The idea, once again, was to force the Allies to bleed over every inch of ground they took, particularly when they entered German territory itself, not the occupied territories, but German territory itself. Eventually, probably in Britain or the United States first, the Germans believed, enemy morale would crack, shattering the grand alliance that they were facing in the field. Hitler loved to quote Frederick the Great, who was once questioned about his strategy against an enemy coalition in the 7 Years' War. The Prussians were facing the French and facing the Austrians, and it was a huge and the Russians, and facing a huge coalition. Somebody said, Frederick, what's your strategy for dealing with superior enemies? And he said, strategy. I'll keep fighting this war until one of our goddamned enemies gets tired. I'll keep fighting this war until one of our goddamn enemies gets tired. If you think how we often hear, well, Hitler was quoting Frederick the Great. He didn't really mean what he was saying, but Frederick the Great is a sort of blueprint for what the Germans were trying to do in 1945. You know, Hitler told his generals on the eve of the Battle of the Bulge, which you've heard all about today, I'll talk a little bit about tonight. He told his generals on the eve of the Battle of the Bulge, we're going to convince the enemy that whatever he does, he can never, and here he paused, he can never count on our surrender. Never. Ever. Silence in the hall. So, unconditional surrender versus total war. Who started it? People always ask this. Was total war a Nazi response to the Allied demand for unconditional surrender? Because you can make a plausible case. Or was unconditional surrender an Allied response to the already clear evidence of Axis fanaticism? You can make a good case there too. It's a chicken and the egg question, and our great Prussian sage of the 19th century, Clausewitz, would probably say it doesn't really matter. Wars increase in intensity the longer they drag on. Strategy becomes more intransigent. You know, you've already invested blood. You know, we always say don't throw good money after bad, but good blood is often thrown after wasted blood. As a lifetime of studying war, you sort of use the casualties you've already taken as a way of making the people keep faith with the war effort. We can't stop now or all the dying and suffering will have been in vain. It's fascinating to me. But these diametrically opposed strategic visions, the ones that defined the war's endgame and made 1945 such a horror show, were born at almost precisely the same moment. If it is a chicken and egg question, it's happening practically in the same week. January, February 1943. The war was going badly for both sides. The Germans had just senselessly sacrificed an entire field army at Stalingrad. In the 1942 campaign, the German 6th Army started the campaign of 330,000 men. It had taken huge casualties by the time it got to Stalingrad, and there it was surrounded. Let's say it had 250,000 men left. And they slowly died of starvation or disease or wounds that couldn't be treated as they were totally surrounded by Soviet forces on all sides. The Germans have just lost a field army at Stalingrad. Their order of battle is going to be light, a complete army for the rest of the war. They'll never make this up. For the Allies, perhaps it wasn't that catastrophic, but the Allies were having a hard time getting on track in early 1943. Their armies were mired in Tunisia, of all places. If I've had to do one thing as a university professor over the years is explain to groups of eager students who want to know about World War II why the U.S. Army was in Tunisia. It seems counterintuitive. It's a long way from Berlin. It's the wrong continent. It doesn't even seem to be precisely in the correct direction. There's an explanation, and we've already had conferences on the war year 1942 and 43. I'll be happy to give you in the question and answer, or buy me a drink at the bar, and I'll lay the whole story on you. But their armies were mired in Tunisia, of all places, a long way from Berlin, at sea in early 1943. Their merchant shipping, the Allied lifeline, was being sunk wholesale by German U-boats. Victory was a long way off for both sides when they decided on their strategies of intransigence on both sides. No quarter, no surrender. And so, as the Julius Caesar might say in this case, Jacta alia est, the die was cast for 1945. An irresistible force, Allied military power, the full range in land, sea, and air, was about to crash into an apparently immovable object. The German people in full Nazi mode, ready to die, men, women, and children, rather than surrender to the hated enemy. Now, Hitler believed that before that could really get started in earnest, there had to be a curtain raiser. And despite all the millions of words that have been spilled about why the Germans launched the Battle of the Bulge, I think we can simply say it was the curtain raiser to his strategy of total war. The great German counteroffensive in the Ardennes Forest in December of 1944 came as a bolt out of the blue to U.S. commanders. The attack, Operation Watch on the Rhine, Wacht am Rhein for the Germans, Battle of the Bulge, as it's better known here in the West, and especially to all the Allied countries, saw multiple German armies smash into a weakly held portion of the U.S. line. The attack made good progress, took thousands of U.S. POWs in the initial stages, and threw a real scare into the Allies, who believed they'd already smashed German military power and that the war was practically over. There's a sort of a schematic maps of the sort I would draw in my undergraduate classes, showing the German penetration of the U.S. line, and then the drive forward, which creates a bulge in the U.S. defenses, hence Battle of the Bulge. A couple of tough U.S. defensive stands at places like Saint-Vite and Bastogne blunted the German drive by the end of December. But horrible fighting, and this leads us into the matter at hand, horrible fighting continued well into January 1945, as the U.S. Army drove the Wehrmacht back to its starting lines and beyond. Now, the Bulge lives on in U.S. memory, both the tough opening and the very proud closing, and then a press conference given by General Montgomery, in which he claimed to be the mastermind for the whole thing. I'm sure you've heard Nigel Hamilton talk about this already today. But above all, we should remember the sacrifice. 81,000 U.S. casualties suffered in this brutal fight in a war that many U.S. intelligence officers at least thought was already over. And so it went in 1945. Month after month of the largest, bloodiest battles of all time. In January and February, the U.S. forces launched an assault on the German Rhineland, filled with bitter and gritty urban fighting. Let's talk about the Rhineland campaign as some kind of footnote to World War II. It's one of the most heavily populated regions of Germany, and today and then one of the most heavily urbanized areas of Germany. This puzzles me. There's something that military historians can't get enough of. It's urban warfare. They love urban warfare. The Battle of Stalingrad, the tractor factory and the vodka factory and the tennis racket and all the Pavlov's house. Individual buildings are very well known. But somehow, the Rhineland campaign has fallen down our collective memory hole. I hope we'll do something about that in this conference this weekend. In March, Allies crossed the Rhine River, the U.S. Army first at Remagen, along with the largest airborne drop in history, Operation Plunder/Varsity, which we're going to be hearing about tomorrow from two experts. I'll be chairing that session, and I can't wait to hear it. The Americans followed up by encircling an entire German army group, that's Army Group B, if you're the sort who wants to know your orders of battle, in the Ruhr under Field Marshal Model in March and April. We say a German army group, we're talking roughly about 500,000 to 750,000 men. Surrounded and carted off into captivity wholesale. The German commander, Walter Model, Field Marshal Model, went into the woods and shot himself famously at the end of the battle, feeling he was about to be blamed for a catastrophe. But I'm not sure what anyone could have done. The Germans had very little fuel. They were practically immobile. And if there's one thing the trump card the Allies had on the ground in 1945 is superior mobility. You give the U.S., crack a seam open in the enemy line and give the U.S. Army 10 minutes to get through it, you're going to have trouble in your rear areas within a couple of days. The U.S. Army, once it had an advantage in World War II, could really go to town in terms of eating up the miles. Field Marshal Model when you say he committed suicide, it deserves to be said, he was seen as one of the tougher characters in the German army. Hitler once said, "Look at his eyes." Do you see his eyes when he talks? Adolf Hitler said that about someone else. As you may know, that's usually what people, I looked into his eyes and I was no longer myself. Hitler went on to say, he's a good general, but I sure as hell wouldn't want to serve under him. Again, Adolf Hitler about Model. But that's Model, the commander at Army Group B. Now, in the east, pardon me, the Red Army erupted out of its bridgeheads on the Vistula River around Warsaw in January They overran Germany's eastern provinces, that's East Prussia in the north, Posen in the center, Pomerania in the northwest, Silesia in the south, in February and March, and then made the final bloody drive into the heart of Berlin in April. There's the Soviets. There's always a blizzard of red arrows when you're doing the Soviet army late in the war. The Battle for Berlin has received the attention it's deserved in a number of books. Anthony Beaver, Cornelius Ryan, and some of the great writers of military history have tender, loving detail every street, every building in the Battle for Berlin. Now, the thing I want to emphasize tonight is that all of these fights generated massive casualties, spectacular casualties. Now, they were in many ways one-sided. The fully mechanized armies of the Allies were killing their adversaries in droves. All those Hanses and Opas we spoke of earlier, slaughtering them, really. Hitler committed many crimes during his abbreviated and miserable life. One of the things was sending off grandsons and grandfathers to fight the Red Army in the closing days of World War II, or the British or American armies in the West. But it's also a fact that enough German defenders remained in the field, true to the calling, to make approaching a German village a crapshoot for any Allied unit. You never knew what you were going to get. Would you get a surrender offer? Maybe. Would you get a blizzard of machine gun fire? Chances were just about equal. Now, you can probably imagine what the eventual solution for the Allies' armies was, and I would say this was especially true of the U.S. Army, was to simply shoot first. Open up with every weapon in the arsenal and flatten the place. And if that didn't work with ground weaponry, if that didn't work with small arms and field artillery, you always had the big gun, which was to call in an airstrike and have them flatten the place. But speaking of air power, it was the same in the air. Allied air forces leveled Germany city by city and town by town. The Luftwaffe had been destroyed largely, and what hadn't been destroyed no longer had fuel to fly. So the U.S. Army Air Forces and the Royal Air Force enjoyed not merely air superiority, which is a good thing to have in battle, but something better, absolute air supremacy. They could bomb cities, rebomb them, and rebomb the rubble until literally there was nothing left to bomb. Famously, everyone knows, at Dresden in February 1945, they burned an entire city to the ground. I grew up in a time when it was said it was unnecessary. Lately, there's been a lot of military scholarship of Dresden's military importance and why it was a legitimate target. I'll let you all sort that out, but at any rate, burning an entire city to the ground. Now, let's also say, since I seem to be on kind of a violence kick here, there was method to this violence. The Allied air forces were destroying the German railway net, and thus they were smashing the German economy to bits every single day, every single bombing raid. Germany's entire war effort depended for its mobility, for transfer of reinforcements and replacements on its rail net. After a while, the Western Allies had come so far and the Soviets had come so far, you could practically walk from one front to the other. But by this time, the rail network had been completely destroyed, and thus the German economy, I think we can say likewise. Now, while the Allies were seeking unconditional surrender, and doing it, con brio, as I hope I'm making a point, the Nazis were keeping pace with total war. It sounds fantastic in a state like National Socialist Germany, but the Germans kept tightening discipline in the ranks. It had never been lax to begin with, shooting and hanging tens of thousands of their own men on often bogus charges of cowardice as a way to encourage the others to fight to the end. And say what you will about German soldiers in World War II, if you're still out there facing the behemoth from both East and West, cowardice probably isn't on the top of your list of characteristics. But Germans were paying the price for these often specious charges, German soldiers. And again, as a way to encourage the others to fight to the end. It's interesting to me, the Germans constantly talked about their manpower problems, and they're also shooting soldiers left and right. The Wehrmacht's final path of retreat was filled with soldier victims dangling from lampposts. The Americans said it, the British said as they'd enter a town, and the Soviets said it over and over and over again. Dozens, hundreds, adding up, I would say, probably to somewhere in the low 10,000s. Germans killed by Germans. Now, the regime also targeted its own officer corps. Let's say you've been told as an officer you need to, there's some malingering in your ranks, you need to hang 30 people. And the officer, so I don't really think that's fair, Mein Führer, or whoever your immediate superior was. The regime also targeted its own officer corps, arresting entire families and holding families as hostages to encourage loyalty within the ranks of the officers. It was a deranged environment, and an increasingly deranged environment. Many German soldiers, they can see the writing on the wall, and they think it's time to surrender. Maybe I'll survive this ordeal after all. But in this environment, the precise timing of surrender, when exactly to hang out that white flag, was a very delicate operation, even, I might say, a matter of life and death. So surrender too late, and the Amis, the Americans, would vaporize your town, one way or the other, either with their ground weaponry or with an airstrike. Surrender too early, and let's say the American schedule for the assault on the town wasn't until tomorrow. Hang out that white flag too early, and a squad of SS men might appear to shoot you, your family, and everyone in your neighborhood. Something that happened repeatedly in the battles of the Endgame, most especially in the battle for Berlin, where blocks changed hands. So you'd hang out the white flag, or fly the hammer and sickle, because the Red Army was in your neighborhood. And then there'd be a counterattack, and the Red Army would be pushed out of your neighborhood, and the SS would have taken control of your neighborhood. And then it was time to get the swastika flag back up. Again, there's novels written about this, but it's really the memoir literature of Allied soldiers on both sides that has just really, I think, nailed the sort of atmosphere in Germany at the end of the war. Finally, at the very end, Hitler decided to destroy every road, bridge, dam, reservoir, public facility in Germany. In other words, to do exactly what the Allies were doing, to smash the German economy. Now, we know why the Allies were doing it, but why Hitler? Well, in his malignant Darwinian view, since the German people had lost the war, they had proven themselves unworthy to live. I think, by the way, I'm Darwinian. I think everybody who has a scientific mind is Darwinian in some sense. I think when you apply Darwin to sort of to social and political groups, you're almost always going to run into trouble. You're almost always talking about murdering some group. In this case, destroying the entire German nation. The Germans had lost the war. They'd proven themselves too weak to survive. They were unworthy to live. Now, a few officials managed to sabotage his orders, but just barely. One of them is Albert Speer. Albert Speer did many horrible things in his career, and he justifiably spent 20 years in prison, convicted and sentenced at Nuremberg. He also probably was one of those, he may have built up his own role in this a little bit too high in his own memoirs, but probably one of those who helped sabotage orders. And when all was lost, everyone in this room knows this as well, Hitler paid the ultimate homage to his concept of total war. He killed himself. A miserable end to a miserable life. As a historian, I often, and I bet many of you do too, I often find myself wishing that I'd been present at some signal historical event. Watching Alexander the Great enter Persepolis. I wish I'd been standing off to the side there with my cell phone, snapping away. Having dinner with Bismarck, having dinner with Clausewitz, having dinner with Martin Luther. Being in the studio when Led Zeppelin recorded When the Levee Breaks. There's a lot of historical events that I wish I had been present for. Led Zeppelin never fails as an applause line. There's other times and places that are really just too numerous to mention. But I have to say, and I will end on this, and I'll paraphrase the Führer himself, I never find myself wishing I'd been in Europe in 1945. Never. Ever. Thank you very much. You know, the last thing, my friends up here who mic'd me said, just be sure you don't put your phone next to the mic. And I just pulled my phone out right next to the mic. It's the craziest thing.
Thank you, Rob. Questions, please raise your hand, and Connie and I will bring the microphone to you. Rob,
I've been told I can walk. I'm still mic'd, right?
we're going to go to your left, halfway back.
Yep.
Hi, Robert. In keeping with your idea that the Germans were going to fight to the bitter end, it seems like Hitler gave up early. I mean, he was being urged by his people to go to Bavaria, to the mountains, to carry it on. I'm just wondering if this idea of the total war was just in the leaders, because once Hitler was dead, once Goebbels was dead, once Himmler, who was head of the SS that was carrying out most of this terror of the population, once he had fled, it's all over in about a week. So I was just wondering why you thought he didn't escape.
I mean, just for the record, Hitler killed himself when the Soviets were practically standing on top of his bunker in downtown Berlin. I don't know how quite early he went. There's, in the German official history of World War II, a series of books which was not written until the 80s and 90s. It's really quite something. They waited a long time because no one knew in Germany exactly what to say about what had just happened. It took a long time. Very scholarly work. There's a lot of talk about, besides total war, which was for the masses, that Hitler and the top Nazi leadership were kind of choreographing their own downfall. And I don't want to get all Wagnerian on the crowd here tonight, but you know, the Nibelungen and the great heroes of German history almost always killed themselves rather than allow themselves to be handed over to their enemies and marched in some kind of triumph and some kind of pathetic triumph where they would lose the dignity that they once had. So I do think that there is something to that notion as well, that total war is largely for the masses. It's something to sell the masses. And one thing we have to say, as a strategy, sure, after Hitler died, things went relatively quickly after that. As a strategy, it was apparently convincing to tens of millions of ordinary Germans. There's even, as you probably know, a wave of suicides throughout Germany. They're going to emulate Hitler. I guess it's all how important you thought you were in the Nazi regime. When we say a wave, you know, it's several thousand. It's not 100,000, but it's several thousand. It's certainly enough to be, enough to be noted. So I would say I think there's that distinction between the leadership and the people. And I think the leadership, Hitler primarily, wanted to leave behind an example that would last, he'd said the Reich would last 10,000 years. Well, it lasted 12 years, so he's partially there. But I think what he wanted was an example that centuries from now people would look back on, and the hero dying more or less on his own shield. Yeah.
And Rob, if you'll allow me while I walk up with the microphone, Florian Huber wrote a book called Promise Me You'll Shoot Yourself a couple of years ago about those suicides.
Has she spoken at the museum?
No.
Okay. Somebody else we should give a phone call to.
As always, Dr. Citino, you were great. Really. Okay.
Appreciate that.
All right. When I read Retribution by Anthony Beevor, and it talked about when the Soviets were coming west towards Berlin, and when they bent to all these towns, okay, they gave the Germans what the Germans had given the Soviets in 1940 when they killed everybody. So my question is, was one of the reasons why they kept on fighting to the bitter end is that the Germans knew what the Russians were going to do to them as they were moving west?
Yeah, sure. I grew up in the Cold War when the atrocious Soviet behavior in Eastern Germany was kind of, it's why we're fighting the Cold War. The Soviet system is inhuman and horrible, which it was. There's been enough history now, and I think we tend to take a little different view, enough history of the Eastern Front, to know how horribly the Wehrmacht behaved when it invaded the Soviet Union. And so Mr. Beevor can write a book called Retribution, right? Isn't that the name of the book? Yeah. So, I mean, that makes a certain amount of sense. And certainly we need to draw some distinctions between the Eastern Front and the Western Front. Most members of the Wehrmacht soldiers in the Wehrmacht wanted nothing more than to escape to the West so they could surrender to the Americans, where they believed, they'd get 3 square meals a day and probably wouldn't be shot on sight. as it was, you know, they were herded into Rhine meadow camps, these sort of open air camps along the Rhine, hundreds of thousands, and sanitation was kind of minimal, and food distribution wasn't always where it should be, but it certainly wasn't a gulag. And so I think we do need to draw those distinctions, and that certainly has a lot to do with the end game. The German, you might say, German guilty conscience. They knew what they had done in the Soviet Union. Of course they knew, and they knew that was some form of that was going to be wrestled back onto them. You know, this made it a little more difficult. There are a lot of officers. For example, at Stalingrad, there's General Seydlitz, one of the great names of Prussian history, who's now commanding a corps at Stalingrad. And you know, he can see that this is a bad campaign. We're trapped out here in a limb. We have no flank protection. The Soviets are going to launch an offensive and surround us, which they did. He wanted to try to break out. He was forbidden to do that. At the end of the Battle of Stalingrad, he went into captivity and you know, worked for the Soviets. He formed a league of German officers and made propaganda, made propaganda on behalf of the Soviets to the German people to overthrow Hitler. He found some following, but by and large, I think most German officers, you can say, hey, you have a history of going against the orders of the king when you know it's bad for the kingdom. The Prussian army did have that history. But the excuse is always, well, if we sabotage the war effort right now, the Red Army is going to be in Berlin next week. But I can't imagine that anything that would have happened in 1943 would have been as bad as what happened in 1945. I'll just say that. Very tough. The officer corps, since I made it seem like they're just passive victims of Hitler's violence, they had been at Hitler's side from the beginning. They paved his way to come to power, and they loved every foreign policy move he made. They loved when he quadrupled and then whatever, 10 times, when he multiplied the defense budget by 10, when the army was suddenly much bigger, and now you were a captain one moment, and then you were a major and a colonel, and all the way up to a general's rank. They loved that. They loved the invasion of Poland. Nobody said a peep about the invasion of the Soviet Union. Whatever many people said after the war, I was against it. Guderian famously in his memoirs said, I thought it was a silly idea. Certainly not what Heinz was saying at the time. So the German officer, of course, kind of morally compromised by their cooperation with Hitler, and it makes perfect sense to me that they sentenced their own men to death, and then kind of complained about how badly they were treated at the end of the war.
Rob, the next question is going to be all the way in the back to your left with Connie.
Oh, yes.
So this is a little off of the World War II topic.
Oh, great.
It has to do with your concept that the longer the war goes on, the worse it becomes, and that rarely are wars won with unconditional surrender. How would you apply that to the American Civil War, which resulted in the unconditional surrender of the Confederacy?
I do know what Clausewitz would say, because he has an entire section in his massive book on war, on civil wars. They almost have to be fought to an end. So they would form, civil wars are wars, and thus they partake of the basic nature of war, but they have specific characteristics in that one of the contestants cannot abide that the other survives. They can't coexist. There can't be a USA and a CSA at the same time. And so they will be fought out to an end one way or the other. They tend to be the most violent and horrible of wars, which, while this is an international conference, the American Civil War was certainly horrible enough, but it doesn't seem, retribution on both sides and massacres on both sides do not appear to have been the order of the day. I'm not a U.S. Civil War expert, as I probably already indicated. There's been a massive amount of scholarship on what was it that kind of limited violence in the U.S. Civil War, when civil wars tend to be the most violent conflicts. If you go back to the Roman Civil War, it was massacre upon massacre upon massacre, both sides attempting to slaughter each other whenever they could. So there's a great deal of scholarship. I'll leave it there so we don't go too far afield, but it's a very, very good question. Civil wars are different.
We're going to stay with Connie towards the back in the center aisle.
Yes.
Thanks for a great talk.
You're welcome.
We hear a lot about the absolute brutality and inhumanity of the Soviets as they entered Berlin. Was there any similar behavior on the American side that's been documented? We know we're always sort of the saintly guys in all of this, but I just wonder. American soldiers committed crimes in World War II. I hope we're all adult enough to be able to say that
in this group, but certainly not on the kind of scale that the Soviets abused the civilian population of the lands they reconquered, where mass killing and mass rape was the order of the day. You know, Stalin famously said, well, what do you want me to do? These guys have, paraphrasing, these guys have fought their way across the continent, and now you want me to yell at them because they steal some trifle or have their way with a woman? Quote unquote. That's quote unquote, the end part of it. Milovan Djilas, the conversations with Stalin, a Yugoslav communist, who jotted down everything Stalin said to him in conversation. You just wouldn't find an American officer ever uttering such a sentence out loud, or if he did, I hope he'd be drummed out of the Corps for cause. So individual U.S. troops commit crimes. Troops who are under the extreme pressures of war, they're being shot at. German machine guns chattering away and killing people both sides. And then suddenly, the machine gun crew, they run out of ammunition, and they put up their hands. Now, sometimes they're taken prisoner and marched to the rear, which is what regulations say. But other times they're shot. You know, certainly after the SS massacres U.S. troops at Malmedy in the Battle of the Bulge, those who were here for the symposium know about this horrible event. Taking prisoners came to be rarer and rarer amongst U.S. troops by the end of the war. So U.S. troops commit crimes in World War II, but there's no wholesale policy of criminality as there was clearly in the Red Army at the end of the war. I think the Soviets lost the Cold War in about the first 3 weeks of their occupation of Berlin. I do. Once all the reports came out about what the Red Army was perpetrating on German soil. It certainly was something I heard about a lot when I was a kid growing up, about what the Soviet Union was like, and almost everybody would go to the Soviet occupation of Germany at the end of the war, but especially the drive into Berlin.
Thank you for a wonderful talk.
Oh, you're welcome.
This is a dumb question, but what's your opinion about the Nazis that hightailed it to South America?
Well, once Hitler died, and then the leadership was wavering, and Dönitz was many things. He's the second Führer. He was Hitler's successor, Admiral Dönitz, but he didn't have that kind of hardcore character that Hitler had, the ability to inspire such fanatical devotion. I think once the leadership is gone and the reins are loosened, I think the French have a great phrase, it's a sauve qui peut, every man for himself. Let everybody save themselves however they can. And some did slide very successfully back into civilian life. Journalists in the early the journalist community in West Germany in the early 1950s is an interesting group. Once you scratch them, they almost all worked for Goebbels' propaganda ministry, because every journalist had to during the Third Reich. And if you wanted somebody who could write a decent topic sentence, you almost had to go with somebody who was morally compromised by the regime. So some try to slide back into civilian life. Others, maybe whose crimes are a little bit more serious, members of the SS, try to get out of Germany whenever they can. There's various kinds of rat lines and underground networks to help some of the worst of the war criminals get out for various reasons. Catholic Church helped some, not a lot. Our CIA, or OSS at the time, helped others for various reasons. So, I don't know what to think of them. Many of these people committed horrible crimes. I'd like to think, well, the war's over, I'm going to stand here and take my punishment. But not everybody does that, of course. I know that's not really realistic.
Rob, we're going to go to your right in the center aisle.
Yeah, I got a couple of hands here. I'm watching Jeremy here. I don't make a move without Jeremy.
You gave us statistics on the Soviet and German deaths in the last 4 months of the war. What were the U.S. comparable statistics? And do you have the numbers for Japan and U.S. In the last 6 months?
I'll leave Japan in abeyance. If Rich Frank is in the audience, and maybe John Parshall's in the audience too, I don't even say Japan if I'm in a room with those two guys. So I'll skip, if you don't mind, I'll skip Japan. You certainly, the two biggest battles in U.S. Army history are, of course, D-Day and the Battle of the Bulge. So if you count the Battle of the Bulge as being 1945, it begins mid-December. There's only a couple of weeks left in 1944, and then it's fought all the way into January. And you add that to the Rhineland fighting, and you add that to again, this kind of grinding campaign through every last village in Germany, never knowing exactly what was going to happen. U.S. casualties are certainly lower than German casualties. There's no doubt about that. 400,000 total dead U.S. dead in World War II. 250 of them from battle causes. There's a huge number of U.S. troops who die in training accidents. It's really, the numbers, Mike, when we first started researching this at the Institute, I just remember being shocked by it. I guess, you take somebody who says, yeah, I can fly an airplane, then you stick them in a cockpit of a P-51, and it's like you drive in my Toyota RAV4 and then suddenly driving Bugatti. It's a very different experience. So the casualties are really, really high. So it's like 250,000 battle dead. If we count the Battle of the Bulge, I have to say at least half of those in the last 4 months of the war. That's making an educated guess here. I don't have the figures, but I think it's a good one.
Rob, towards
There's somebody
the front,
right behind
to
you.
your
I don't know
left.
if you wanna... Oh, okay. All right.
With
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. All right. I just didn't know. All right.
Rob, thanks very much. A couple of comments and a question. First of all, you wrote one of the best articles I've ever read about the fate of the 106th Division for World War II magazine about 6-7 years ago.
Yeah, sure.
Thought it was superbly done.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
Recently, I was looking at a YouTube video on the Battle of the Bulge, and just reading through the comments, and people were commenting how big a battle it was, and then one person said, the Battle of the Bulge, if this was a Russian front, this is called a Tuesday,
Yeah, sure. Okay.
But anyway.
I have a comment on that, but ask your question. Okay.
So my question is, I had a very, very distant relative who was involved with the liberation of Dachau. And upon, the story I was told, upon seeing a room full of children in baby shoes, he and others went out, lined up about 8 Germans against a wall, killed them all. They got arrested, got all the way up to Patton, he dismissed it. My question is, did you start to see a change in American soldiers' behavior as they start to liberate the concentration camps?
So let me first comment on, this will be a Tuesday on the Eastern Front. It included elements of 2 full U.S. armies, the most highly mechanized armies on the planet, and considerable input from the British as well. The second most heavily mechanized army on the planet. Air power at a level that the Soviets could never have dreamt of. So I wouldn't say the Battle of the Bulge was a Tuesday. I understand the point. Kasserine Pass, which gets a lot of attention from the Americans, involved a single U.S. corps. So it's big to Americans, if you compare it to what was going on the Eastern Front. So that's ours, El Alamein from the British perspective. If you compare that to what's happening on the Eastern Front, it's like Tuesday. I understand the point, but I wouldn't say that about the Battle of the Bulge, or I wouldn't say that about the entire final campaign into Germany and up to the Elbe. Your question, was there a kind of a cultural change or a change of mood amongst U.S. troops after they began to liberate the camps? And I'd say clearly there was. But what was also happening is it was a very difficult fight. Everybody said the war's over, but people have been killed on all sides. Your buddy here and your buddy there. They've both been killed trying to liberate some German village whose name you can't even pronounce because the local SS commander decided to make it a test case, and so he's going to fight to the end, and then they all tried to surrender at the end. So killing of prisoners is also happening in that context as well. There's some well-known and some not so well-known episodes in which troops are killing SS guards at concentration camps, and then some officer kind of finally gets them under control and stops them in mid-fire. There's some really, really hair-raising stories along those lines. Our author Alex Kershaw has famously written a book about the Thunderbird Division, I guess it was 45th, in which he talks about that very episode. So it is the liberation of the camp, certainly. You're really getting Nazi inhumanity in your face. There's no doubt. But it's also the very difficult nature of the fight. I think the two of them are working together. I hate to prioritize one over the other.
Rob, we're going to have one last question right here.
Oh, wow. I was going to say we'll do this all night, or 7:30, whichever comes first.
Thank you very much. Thank you for a brilliant presentation.
Oh, thank you very much.
Very, very much.
Oh, geez. Thank you.
There are 2 items which, from my perspective, stand out. You emphasize the extremely high casualty rates and the resistance on the part of the Germans till the end of April.
Yes.
To what extent, if at all, did this experience influence the U.S. strategy in Asia vis-a-vis Japan?
It's a good question.
Let's assume the Battle of the Bulge hadn't occurred and Patton had been in Berlin by January. I'm making this up. Would the Pacific Theater have ended differently?
That's an interesting question. Unconditional surrender. I've spoken tonight about the Germans because, you speak about what you know, and that's what I know. So I deliberately left Asia out of the equation. But just for the record, unconditional surrender was for the Germans, the Italians, and the Japanese. At the time it was proclaimed, it's almost seems, well, that's a long way off. How does this help me get through the next week? That's what field commander might be saying, unconditional surrender. So Roosevelt repeatedly mentions all three powers, Germany, Italy, Japan, Germany, Italy, Japan. Says it over and over again. So Germany and Italy is the European equation, and Japan is the Asian equation. So it's interesting to me. I'll go out on a limb and make at least a kind of comment about the Japanese, Rich. See, Rich ready to pounce here. Japanese came up with a kind of similar strategy for the war's endgame. They were going to arm the civilian population and put tens of millions of aroused Japanese in the field with sticks and stones if that's what it took, and take an American with you as he lands. First on the southern islands, and then up on the big island, the large island of Honshu. So it's interesting that these fanatical fascist powers, and I think we can certainly include Japan there, came up with a kind of similar strategy. And that gets me back to my chicken or my egg. Is unconditional surrender, is that a response to unconditional surrender? Or was unconditional surrender the only sensible policy to adopt, given the kind of fanatical resistance these states were likely to prosecute against the Allies? It's interesting to me. I don't have an answer to that, but it's something that keeps me awake at night. So no, I think my answer to your question is I don't think it would have changed. I think the Americans would have done just what they did, and they still would have gotten the bomb, and that leads to us. That's kind of a break. You have strategy, and it seems to imply going through the Japanese home islands village by village, but then there's a break. There's a short circuit at the end in the historical time stream, and that is, of course, the invention of the atomic bomb. Roosevelt could not possibly have known the timing of when he would have an operational atomic weapon in his arsenal at the moment he declared unconditional surrender. He could not possibly have known that. It's unclear as to exactly what he did know, how long it would take, how effective it would be. Nobody really knew until they blew one up in June of 1945. So the complexities of the end of the war in the Pacific and in Asia continue to boggle my mind. I have the utmost respect for Rich's scholarship, of course, but I really respect for his courage in taking on this topic. It's just amazing. It's filled with controversy every step of the way. Americans don't like to hear a lot of discussion of the bomb. We had one, and we used it, and it's over. But there's more to be said about that, and I think Rich has adopted it, to my mind, the only sensible kind of middle position about the atomic bomb. So buy Rich's books.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Rob Citino.
Thank you. Thank you, brother. Oh, that was fun.